because um, whatever I can tell you, I'm very sure our esteemed comic doctor Stephanie Shelton can say it better. So let me give a formal introduction um, to someone I've been friends for. I mean, I don't know how long, but it has been a while.
Years,
It's been years. I mean, at least 5 or 6.
at
I
least.
think I think around the time I started going back to ARA, we became friends, and I think you were still in grad
That's
school.
right.
You were at UGA at the time still.
That's right.
And I was just, I think that was the time I think I just got tenure around that time. So let me introduce you to Dr. Stephanie Shelton. She is an assistant professor at the University of Alabama. She got her Ph.D. at the University of Georgia. She's already gotten several awards recognizing her incredible scholarship in her early career, and she's had incredible publications in peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, all of which are, if you can get a hold of them, are worth reading um, top to bottom. Um, so she's definitely, and she's um, right now she's working out doing most of her work in qualitative inquiry. So she's someone who has also background in language and literacy, like I do. But I mean, I think we have moved more into like going as a full-time methodologist in your own right. Um, I invited Stephanie to the class today because I always like to have this last session in the research one class when you're talking about this idea of figuring out qualitative research and trying to understand what it means to do qualitative research from the perspective of someone who's not just doing it but living it, because I think that's an important consideration that we don't just do qual, we live qual, we sometimes breathe qual. Otherwise it's kind of difficult to do it. So with after this introduction, I am going to stop talking. I'll let Stephanie introduce herself, tell you a little bit about her journey and some considerations about qualitative inquiry. And at some point, folks, this is not a lecture. This is more like like an actual conversation. So at some point, just feel free to just raise your hand and using the Zoom um, thing, and we'll open the floor for you for questions. So Stephanie, what all yours?
Awesome. Yeah, I want to. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm very excited. And if I say something that you have a question about or it's unclear, just please say so. When Raúl invited me to talk with you, one of the things he said was to talk about my journey as a qualitative researcher, and I was like, oh, what a journey it's been. So I want to start by saying that you all already at this stage in your education and your career, like you know more now about qualitative research when I was where you are scholastically. I didn't even learn the term qualitative research until I was in my PhD program. Um, and so when I was where you are, I was getting a master's in English. I was going to be a Shakespearean scholar. And that's what I was going to do. And uh, a number of things changed. I got a master's in English, and then there was like this huge shortage of high school teachers where I was living. And so they had a lot of financial incentives to be a teacher. And I wish that I could say that I went into teaching for a more noble cause, but it was because of the financial incentives. And they were all at, high needs schools. That's where the shortages were. And so I went in, I had to be there for, I think, a year and a half to benefit from the financial incentives they were offering. I stayed there for 10 years. I loved it. It was great. Um, and and over time, because I was in a high needs school, we went through administrators. If any of you have taught or have went to school in those sorts of spaces, we went through administrators, principals pretty quickly. We had a number of them over the 10 years that I was there. And each time we changed principals, there was more micromanagement of the students and the teachers. And it just really got to the point to where I felt pretty insulted by the adults. The kids were never the problem. The kids were always amazing. And I was a high school English teacher, and so that's what I was doing. And I mainly taught American literature, and there's reasons for that I'll go into if you're curious. But um, I I got really tired of having administrators who could not do my job telling me how to do my job. There just came a point where ever since I had been like in elementary or middle school, I had always said like I'm gonna get a PhD, and my mom was like, "Okay, sweetie, sure." I was like, I need to do something different before I end up in trouble, before I say something I shouldn't say to people who are in charge. And so I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna go back and get a PhD because I don't have enough letters after my name for the people in the school to listen to me. And so I went into a PhD program with the intent to return to the classroom. And I was going to then have all the fancy letters I needed, and go back into a space where maybe I would be listened to more and I could advocate more on behalf of the students and the parents and guardians. And so when I started my teaching career, this is important to me becoming a qualitative researcher. When I started my teaching career, I was selected to be my school's teacher of the year, which was great, wonderful, fantastic. And then we had like a school district level competition. And I was selected to be the district level teacher of the year, which was also very exciting and amazing and wonderful. And then I got notification that I had been selected to be a finalist for the state teacher of the year, which is also very exciting. Um, and the reason that matters is because part of um, being a finalist for the state teacher of the year was being invited to be a part of the state superintendent's teacher advisory council. And if you don't know, the state superintendent is the person who is in charge of educational policy and mandates for the state. And so I was really excited because there were a number of policies, bills, laws that were really problematic, were clearly created by lawmakers who had never been educators. And so I was really pumped. I'm like, yeah, this is going to be amazing. Finally, they're going to hear from teachers. And so I get there, um, and there was a bill on the docket, and I cannot remember what the bill was anymore. But it was very clear immediately that this was a bill that was going to disproportionately negatively affect low-income students. And so a number of other a number of other teachers and I immediately started to protest this bill. This is terrible. We can't have this. And we each shared examples, stories of students we knew who would just be crushed under this bill they were proposing. And I remember after several teachers had spoken, one of the legislators kind of sat up and very condescendingly said, these are stories. We need data. We can't make policy decisions with your stories. And I remember sitting there and thinking, these stories are data, but I don't know how to articulate that they are. Like I don't have the know-how to tell you how you're wrong. And so after that experience happening multiple times, as a part of being that board, and part of it I realized was they wanted teachers to be there so that they could say that teachers had been in the room, not because they actually wanted teachers to have any sort of actual say. And so after that, and then just various principals just being very micromanaging relative to what we were being told to do in our classrooms. I went to a PhD program, and Peter Smagorinsky was my advisor, my major professor, and I should have said this at the very beginning. I'm a first generation academic, and when I say that, and I think some of you probably will be able to identify, no one in my family on either side, my mother or my father, no one in my family on either side, all the way out to like third and fourth cousins, no one had ever gotten a college degree ever. And then eventually like one cousin on my mom's side and my brother eventually got a college degree as well. But no one in my family on either side, all the way out, no one has ever gotten a graduate degree except for me. I'm the only one. And so when I started to go into a PhD program, I had no idea what I was doing. clueless. And so I remember I called Peter and I was like, yo, like, I don't, what do I, like, what do I register for? Like, what I mean, I'm looking at like the course requirements, but I don't even know what these things are. And it's a PhD, so there's like research requirements. And I'm like, I don't, what are these things? And he's like, well, I don't know. What do you want to get out of research? And I'm like, well, I don't know. What do I need to know? And he said, well, what do you want research to do? And I told Peter that story about the state legislator. And I said, what I want research to do is equip me to tell people like him how they're wrong. And so he said, well, qualitative research it is. And I was like, I don't know what that is, but I'm excited. And so I enrolled in qualitative research, and I had Jude Priceley, who I know that Raúl does. She got the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry a few years ago. Like, she's like the qualitative goddess. And I had no idea. I did not know I was being taught by like this legend in qual. I'm just like, I don't know where I am. I don't know what these words are. And my first semester in qualitative research was me looking up the same words over and over and over. I didn't know the terms. I didn't know the names, because remember, I was going to be a Shakespearean scholar. And so I had come out of the humanities. And then I had been a high school teacher. And so all my educational background was very like implementation practice based. And so I had understandings of, like, for example, like literary theories, but I was not a social scientist. I had not been educated in social science. And so the first semester, I felt completely lost. I felt totally overwhelmed. I didn't know any of the people that other people were throwing around. I didn't know any of the terms people were throwing around. We would read things and I would feel like I was learning, but then we'd be getting class and I'm like, well, clearly I misunderstood that entirely. I felt so overwhelmed and I felt so dumb. And the thing is, like, I mean, generally speaking, most of us who choose to get graduate degrees, we do school pretty well. And you know, we and others who know us believe that we are intelligent humans. And so here I am in this class, and I'm like, I don't know anything. But at the end of the class, I really felt like I learned a lot. I didn't necessarily feel like I could, like, you know, go back and like storm the building and find that legislator and, you know, shake it by the collar, but I felt like I knew more, right? And so I had to take another research class because, again, PhD is a research requirement. So I took Qual 2, and that's when it started to click. And so meanwhile, my PhD is in language and literacy education. And so I'm teaching teacher education courses with people. I'm teaching people who are going to be high school teachers. Um, and while I'm teaching them, I'm taking these qualitative research courses. And one of the classes that I taught these future teachers was a class that was specifically about like social justice issues in education. And while I had been a high school teacher, I had been very upfront and very open about being a queer person, identifying with the LGBTQ plus community. And I realized that because I was in a high need school, this is going to sound terrible, but I realized that because I was in a high need school, they were constantly having to like bring in new teachers anyway. It was a revolving door of teachers. And they weren't going to fire me. I'm like, they're not going to fire me. I mean, I'm a warm body that knows what I'm doing. They're going to keep me, even if, you know, they don't necessarily think that, you know, if they think I'm a terrible human, they're still going to let me keep my job. And so I was very out and open as a high school teacher. And the only people who ever had problems with it, as an aside, were some of the adults. But when I got into my doctoral program, I was very candid with these future teachers about, like, this is who I am, this is how this mattered. And they had a lot of questions because we were in, if you're not familiar with the term, Georgia, where I was getting my PhD, is in what's called the Bible Belt. And it's called that because a lot of people's very conservative fundamentalist Christian beliefs guide a lot of decision making and policy and even laws. And so we're teaching in the Bible Belt. They're going to student teach in the Bible Belt. I had been a high school teacher in the Bible Belt. And so they're like, you know, like, what you say sounds great, but we don't really know how to do that. And so I didn't I didn't have time in class to go through all the various things that they might be able to do. And so I'm learning this qual stuff, and I'm having these conversations in this classroom with these future teachers, and I start to realize, like, this is where the roads can meet. Like, this is where the twains can twine, if you will, right? Like, this is where I can start to bring these two things together. And so I went and talked to the program director of this cohort, and I said, you know, look, like, this is what's happening in the classes. They're very interested in these topics. They want to know how to do this work well. I don't have time to do this and do all the other things that I have to do for this class. Would you be open to me offering like an optional discussion group on these topics? And I laid out for her, you know, like, you know, these are the things that I've learned in qualitative research. You know, it would include like some focus group interaction with them. It would include some individual interviews with them to, you know, to talk to them individually and so on. And she was totally on board, 1000%, absolutely. Um, and so I filled out my first IRB. I again had no idea what I was doing. Took it to Peter, and I was like, help me with this thing. And so finally got it approved. It was fine. Um, and so all of a sudden I was doing qualitative research, and I was doing qualitative research on something that was very important to me as a professional, very important to me as a former classroom teacher, very important to me as I imagined who I had been as like a classroom student. And so my beginning of like doing qual was me doing qual that mattered, and that I felt like would matter to other people, including, you know, students. And so that was my first research project, and that actually became the basis of my dissertation. And so it was a question of like, how did they navigate this effort to be a supportive LGBTQ plus positive teacher in these socio-politically conservative spaces? Like, what did that work look like? Um, there were and there were numerous times when things went awry. Actually, I wrote a paper on one focus group that the group actually had, where, I mean, it went to hell. Frankly, they were arguing, they were yelling at one another. I wrote another paper on a focus group where they really were struggling to understand queer identities as mattering in terms of racial and ethnic identities. Um, but I was doing work that was really important and was really making a difference in terms of how they felt like they had agency to do these things in their own classrooms. And so when they graduated and they went into high school settings full time, um, they wanted to know, like, can we continue this? And so the research project continued. And at this point, like, I'm in my I think third year of my PhD program at this point, and I start to realize that as much as I love language and literacy, as much as I love being a high school teacher, what I'm really loving is the research, because now I've learned how to explain that stories matter. I've learned to explain that human experience is an important part of understanding. I've learned to explain the benefits of having accessible scholarship, that it's not completely lost in you know, just esoteric jargonish mumbo jumbo. I've learned ways to I've begun to learn how to like write for publication, and I'll talk about that experience if you want me to talk about it. Um, but I've started to learn that it's the research parts that I feel really empowered doing. Um, keep the high school teacher focus. I can keep the interest on social justice issues and education. Like, I can keep all those things and then be a researcher. Plus, I can do other things, because I like, at this point I started to realize that the actual like literacy components, like, you know, teaching students literacy, engaging in digital literacies, like, those are things that are really important, and they drove, you know, how I taught my students when I was a high school teacher. They drive still how I teach college students, but they weren't necessarily what I wanted to like to really research. They're things I wanted to do, but they weren't things that I wanted to like really dig into. And so I started to joke with my friends. I was like, I want to be a methodologist when I grow up. And I will say as an aside, like taking you back to that very first semester in qualitative research where I was completely lost, the word methodologist terrified me. It had too many syllables, it had too many letters, and I didn't understand it. And so for me to be like, I want to be a methodologist when I grow up, my friends are like, really? And I'm like, I do. But Georgia didn't offer a PhD in qualitative research at the time. They did later. But it was too late for me to like shift degrees at that point and then actually graduate in a reasonable time frame. Um, so I talked to Peter, who was my advisor, and I'm like, hey, look, I think that my dreams, ambitions, goals in life have changed. I really think that I want to try to figure out a job where I do research on research, and I do research on these topics that really matter to me. And I said, I think that I want my classes in the future to be about helping students understand how research can be accessible, how research is important, how research is empowering. Like, I think that's what I want to do as a faculty member. And so Peter was on board, and he's like, okay, let's figure this out. And so I started to change my trajectory, because what I had planned to do initially, I planned to like go back into a high school classroom, more letters after my name, maybe people would listen to me. But then after that, I started to think, well, I can do teacher education. Like, this is really cool to empower them, to teach them things that it took me years to figure out. So that when they go into the classroom spaces, they don't have to like go through this trial and error that I had to for so many years. But then I started to realize, like, it was the research projects that I was engaging with outside of the classes that were really exciting to me. And that honestly, for a lot of them, like, brought them to class too. And so I'm like, I want to do this full time. Like, I want to be like a for real researcher. I want to do methodology. I want to teach methodology. I want to study methodology. I want to do methodology. And so we started to kind of like shift my trajectory, what I was writing about, what I was researching. I started to play with different ways to collect data, started to play with different ways to analyze data, things that just 2 years before I would have been absolutely, clueless to do, or if I had not been clueless, I would have been terrified to do. And it's like, it was really freeing, and really empowering to just think back, like, just 2 years ago, I couldn't have done any of this. And now, like, I want to do it like full time. And so when I shifted over to like this mindset of I'm going to do methodology, um, I started to like really look at like like the tools of the trade, if you will. And so, like, for example, like, I've been doing all these focus groups and all these interviews, with these student teachers, and then like when they became like full-time teachers, and I started to look at, like, how was I affecting that data collection. So, like, what was the effect of my interview questions? What was the effect of my facilitation and focus groups? And started to like learn a lot about and like reflect on like myself, like as a research instrument. Um, and to stop just treating the data as if it was just happening, but to like really explore and think about, like, what was I doing to create that space? What was I doing to either facilitate or hinder? And in doing that, so like one of the very first articles I ever wrote was about how I just was interviewing all wrong. And so I learned through looking at my mistakes, I learned how to do a better job. And so, like, so one of the very first articles that I wrote was like just me thinking through and giving examples of this process of like asking these interview questions that I wanted them to, again, tell me stories. Like, I wanted them to describe these moments to me, but what I was instead asking them to do as an example was like, um, apologies. I would say, tell me about some bullying that you've observed in your classroom. And so that's what they would do, is exactly what I'd ask them to do. They would start, like, laundry listing, give me a list of instances where they'd observed bullying. And that wasn't what I wanted, but that's exactly what I was asking them to do. And so I learned instead to start asking more narrative-based questions, like, think about a moment when you've observed bullying in your student teaching placement. Can you tell me about that moment? And so it was like really thinking about different ways that, because I learned how stories matter. So then it became a question of like how do I help facilitate space for those stories to happen? And so it's no coincidence if you look at my CV, the bulk of my scholarship is narrative based, and all of it goes back to that very beginning, and me just being really angry about this person telling me stories aren't data. I make it my mission now to emphasize that not only are they, but it's important, essential, indispensable data in any form of decision making, in education. Um, but I started to really think about like what was I doing, and how did that matter in that space. And so when I went on the job market, I was open to potentially doing teacher education because there frankly are more teacher education jobs than there are methodology jobs. But I really wanted to be a methodologist. And so when this job posted at Alabama, I don't know how much all of you know about the state of Alabama, but it has a lot of stereotypes assigned to it. And one of those stereotypes is that it's not a very LGBTQ plus friendly space. And so when the job posted, I was like, I'm good. I don't need to be in Alabama, thanks. And one of the qualitative research professors at Georgia was like, no, you're going to apply for this job. And so I begrudgingly did to get her off my back. But when I came here for my job interview, it became very clear that there was a genuine community of qualitative scholars here who were excited about their work, were excited about my work, and then it was a space where I could be really not just happy, but I mean like really supported, really celebrated. And so I came to my campus interview angry because I'm like, I don't want to live in Alabama. I left my campus interview really excited and hopeful that they would offer me a job, which was a weird shift in just 3 days. But I've been here for 4 years now, and I teach qualitative research. Like all of my courses are qualitative research. And so this semester, as an example, I'm teaching a class on qualitative case study research, and I'm teaching qualitative research one. And the qualitative research one class is a beginning level class. They're all doctoral students, but they've learned to be afraid of research. They've learned to be afraid of research being too hard. They've learned to be intimidated by the concept. And when I see them, I see me at the beginning of my trajectory where I was similarly intimidated by these concepts and terrified by these terms. And so there's this one of the books that I use in my qualitative research class is Joseph Maxwell's Applications of Qualitative Research. That's not the title. I can see the book in my head, but it's something about like qualitative. But anyway, there's a part in the book where he says you don't need to wear a tuxedo on your brain. And I bring that up when I'm teaching qualitative research all the time. And I want to say that to all of you too. When you're doing research, one of the reasons stories matter that I've learned, and this is one of the ways that I'm able to articulate it now, is that stories kind of rip the tuxedo away. Stories are a mode of communication that exists across most cultures, that exist across most nations, exists across most languages. It's a societal norm that isn't necessarily that isn't a product of Western colonization. And stories give people spaces to describe their experiences on their terms. It's not through a forced response survey. It's not through a highly controlled interview space. It's not through a really structured focus group interaction. It's asking them an open-ended question and letting them talk about what they know, what they've experienced, who they are on their terms. And I don't want to pretend that there aren't power structures in interviewing, because there are. But it's been really lovely to be able to learn a lot from them, because when I first started interviewing, to look at the transcriptions and just look at like how much I talk versus how much they talk, it was pretty equal. And since then, like I've learned, like I need to just shut up and give them spaces to talk. And I've learned so much about being an interviewer. I've learned so much about being a researcher. I've learned so much about like the topics that I study because I get out of the way now, and I've learned to do that. And so one of the things that I do is teach my students not to put tuxedos on their brains, not to get bogged down in all of the gibberish fancy terms, not to be intimidated because they don't know the fancy terms, but to understand that research can be a very humanizing process. Research always requires humans. Even if you're going to do quantitative research, that data originated from people at some point. And people are going to crunch those numbers and analyze those outcomes. qualitative research is necessarily humanizing and human because so much of it is so directly tied to interactions with people. Um, Sometimes people don't like qual because that human element makes it messy and unpredictable. I mean, there's things will go awry. Like for example, the focus group where they yelled at one another. You can get into an interview and you realize that like I've had participants cry not because of the interview itself, because they just had a really rough day. But then that becomes part of my responsibility as an interviewer. Thinking about like how do you negotiate and navigate those spaces, and where does the human experience and human life end and the research begin? And the answer with qual is not, no. They're always sort of enmeshed and muddled together, and it's messy, it's unpredictable, but it's also kind of the point. And it's the reason that qualitative research is important. I will also say as an aside, I do a lot of work now with government agencies. And it's funny because a lot of them, they'll have done survey-based research for decades, and they won't know why they're not getting the information that they need. And so they'll approach someone, and eventually it'll get to me in various ways. And the problem is that you need to talk to people. Like the problem, like you need to actually talk to them, because you giving them a forced response option or you giving them a little box to type in is not going to get you what you want. Um, and so, as an example, for those of you who are survey inclined, one agency had an item where they were asking students. It was like an enrichment program. Like there were no grades. It was intended to foster creativity and excitement. And one of the items they had on their survey was like how rigorous was the program, because they wanted this program to be very challenging for the students. And the students over and over and over again said, it's not, it's not, it's not. And so for decades, this program had like been at the teachers about like, we got to make this more rigorous. It's got to be challenging. And just got to the point where the teachers were like, look, like we can't make this any more challenging without like, strapping weights to them and like making them like slog through mud while they read. Like, what do you want us to do? And that's when they realized maybe the information they were collecting was problematic. And so that's when I got brought in. And so I'm like, like, do you know what they think that word rigorous means? And the answer was they didn't, right? And so it was a moment where it's like, you need to talk to people. You need to know what people think. You need to know how people understand, because a survey can't let you do that. It just doesn't provide the space for that. And so we did several focus groups and a number of individual interviews with students. And what it boiled down to was when they saw the word rigor, they thought about like, standard school, standardized school, grading and tests and standardized tests. And so when they were asked, was the program rigorous? What they were reading was like, is this program like regular school? And so they were answering over and over again, no, not at all. But then the agency saw that and was like, oh, we're not challenging these kids. And so they changed the instrument so that the question became like, has this program pushed you to think and learn differently than a standard school setting? And then it was like 99.9% strongly agree. And so that's an example of just a way that like qualitative research, it necessarily humanizes data collection processes. It necessarily humanizes understanding, because it centers the human experience. It centers how we think, how we learn, how we live, how we love. And sometimes the only way that you can get to that is just to talk to folks. But I think like that's like a huge overarching overview of like how I landed in this space, and how I understand qual. I do appreciate what Raúl said earlier. It it is it is something that you live. I find myself constantly like observing people and examining interactions between them, like just in a regular space. I'm at the University of Alabama. Football's huge here, and so like a football game, like I mean, I can't help but like examine different modes of interaction, different modes of communication. But it's made me a better communicator in general, frankly, because I've learned to communicate so clearly and concisely as a researcher that I mean now just as a human being, like parts of who I am as a qualitative methodologist, like they're constantly just a part of how I interact. They're constantly a part of the way that I think. And the other part of it is like because qualitative research is so human centered, and is so built on the premise that, like, we're building this research understanding together. That's how I see education. That's how I see like life experience. Like everything is co-constructed. We build experiences, we build realities together. And so it's not like I have like a qual hat I put on and then I take it off. It's the way that I function and navigate the world, period. And while what I do for a living still remains very mysterious to my family, I do feel pretty well equipped to explain to them. Like I interview people, I get to talk to people and learn how they think. I get to talk to people and learn what they believe. And it's pretty easy to explain to them then like why that matters, why that's useful, and why that's helpful to education, which is the field I'm in, but just period. And so that's like a long rambling sort of overview of who I am and why I am where I am. But I am very open to any and all questions that you have, and I will be as open and honest as I can possibly be. And if I don't know, I will tell you I don't know, because there's a lot of things I still don't know. Still learning.
As we all are. Yeah, this was. I mean, I was just paying attention to your introduction, um, and there's so many elements there, and I think I actually wanted to start. I mean, kind of like wanted you to talk a little, because I mean, again, just to bring it into the context of the class. Um, and I agree with you that and I was, when you started talking about your journey, I was actually thinking about the whole idea of the jargony part and all the terminology. And I remember my first
So
methods
much of
class.
that stuff. Ugh.
I still remember my first methods class, and I was like, I was so lost,
Mm-hmm.
especially because, because I mean, all doc students are always throwing the theories and throwing the big words, and I was like,
Yeah, there's so much fronting that goes on.
yeah, and I was like a first year master's student when I took my first methods class, and I'm like, what am I doing here? Like, I was fortunate. I had an amazing instructor, and Leora Bresler helped me. She actually the kind of professor that makes you fall in love with research. And I guess that's why I'm here in a way, because
Yeah.
I mean, I took that class with Leora, and I never looked back. But I think it's important to clarify. I mean, I like that quote about the tuxedo. I think that quote is huge. And so I wanted to bring the conversation into the context of where we are right now.
Yeah.
All the students here, there's the 8 students in the class, and so I told you that the 8 students. I invited Diego, one of my advisees that you know,
Mm-hmm.
and this Edison and Zadie, my teaching assistants, the people I'm hoping in a very near future will be teaching this course in my stead. Um, they're all still trying to figure out their path. Um,
Yeah.
and right now the students,
Me too.
well, I'm still trying to. I mean, I'm figuring it out as I go. I mean, that's the way I do research. They're trying to figure out, how to situate or where to get the research problem from. So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my question would be, uh, what is your thought process when you are trying to design or think about a research proposal or a research project?
Yeah.
What is your thought process?
That's a great question. I think for me, it's a matter of my research problems, my research questions are always based in things that I've experienced, or that I care about. The only time that I ever engage in research that is just like it's someone else's problem or someone else's question is if I'm getting paid to do it by an agency. And even then, most of the time, I figure out ways to connect to it and to make it matter. But for example, I mean, like the reason that I engaged in my very first research project with the student teachers was because it mattered to me. I had been a high school teacher. I had been a queer kid sitting in a classroom in the Bible Belt. I was their instructor, wanting them to do well. And so that's one of the reasons that matters, because I knew like I can help to explore these topics with them. I just can't do it in class. Another project that my colleague, Kelly Guyett and I are doing here at the University of Alabama. My first year as a faculty member, because I mean, like you're not like I had never been a faculty member before, right? And so it's like you don't know what you're doing. We don't know what we're doing. Spoiler alert. but but students would come to my office, and a lot of times they would just be utterly overwhelmed by doctoral research, by graduate research, utterly overwhelmed by this feeling of inadequacy, this feeling of this imposter syndrome, this feeling of like, I don't know what, like, I don't know everything that everybody else seems to know, although they don't know it either. That's one of the reasons they talk so big, frankly. But it's like they were completely overwhelmed. A number of them, were parents with children, or they were taking care of their parents. And so I just had a number of students like break down and cry in my office. And I was talking to Kelly Guyot, and I'm like, does this ever happen to you? And she's like, it does. It happens to me a good bit. And then we started like, we would check in with one another, and we realized it wasn't students, it was women who were pursuing graduate degrees that were breaking down in our offices and crying. And so Kelly and I started to think about like, what does it mean to be a woman pursuing an advanced degree? And so that's where that research project originated from. It's like our own experiences, like sitting in our offices, thinking about our own experiences as women in academia. And so there's been a number of projects that have come from just that initial sort of experience slash problem slash question. Another thing that I've written a good bit of late about transcription, interview transcription. I don't know anyone who loves to do it. It's tedious, time consuming. But I remember it became like something that came to my attention. It was a problem. When I was at Georgia, there was a woman who was affiliated, like we all knew her through the university, and she would do paid transcription work. And I've always only ever done my own transcription because frankly I was too poor to pay somebody to do it for me. Period. Grad student life is real. But other people were in different sort of socioeconomic situations and so could. And I remember thinking to myself, like, because some of my participants were like literally doing things that would have gotten them into serious trouble if administrators had known what they were doing, because some of these people are like incorporating issues of gender and sexuality into their classrooms, and they're doing it to subvert a lot of social norms. But if other people knew, it could seriously get them into trouble. And I remember thinking, if my participants knew that I was going to hand this raw data with their voice, with their actual names, with the names of places, the names of people before it had ever been de-anonymized, or anonymized rather, before it was ever anonymized, if they knew I was going to hand that raw audio data to someone and just let them transcribe it, they would not talk to me the way that they talk to me now, because they trust that like that privacy, right? And the compounding factor was that this woman was from that community, and so some of the people they were talking about were people she would have known. And so I'm thinking in my head, like, why is nobody else concerned about this issue? And depending on how IRBs work, sometimes you're not required to disclose to participants that you're going to use an outside transcription service. And it just really bothered me that it was apparently, because transcription is so tedious, it was okay to just hand that raw data to a stranger and let them make sense of it. And so I took that and I wrote it down. Like I had like a little, like just like a little book of like thoughts while I was a doc student. Because you got to take classes, you got to write a dissertation, you got to get stuff done. But when I had finished, I went back to that book and I was like, transcription. And so that's where that project came from, was like, just my alarm at this issue of privacy and anonymity that we assure participants that they have, but then often don't provide them because we don't want to do the laborious work of transcribing an interview. And so I've written several papers on transcription. And so in terms of where do my research projects come from? Where do my research questions come from? The problems always come from my experiences. And that kind of makes sense given the fact that I do very narrative-based research. And so my research questions are often interrogating what are other people's experiences, what are other people's understandings of this thing that I've thought about. And so for me, um, I I always explore things that I care about, and that I think are important, and often are especially important because they're they're ignored, or they're not taken up in meaningful ways. And so transcription's one, but just like the issue of like the gendered process of getting a graduate degree. There's a lot of literature on like women in academia, but it mainly is like this idea of like this fictional work-life balance that women are supposed to have. And so that leaves women feeling like they're not doing an adequate job if they're not somehow creating this magical non-existent balance between family and work. But there aren't like people aren't talking about like the emotional toll that takes. People aren't talking about the fear of inadequacy, or the degree of increased divorce risk for women who are pursuing doctoral degrees but their husbands are not, and so on and so forth. And so it's like when people take up issues of gender in higher education, it's always not always, it's nearly always tapping back into these very cliche notions of things like work-life balance, that sound great but really are just not very practical or helpful. And so that's how I land on like what I'm gonna explore and study. Right now, what I'm doing is working a good bit with doctoral students about like what does mentorship look like in qualitative research. And I care about that, number one, because it mattered a whole lot to me. It's one of the reasons that I ultimately felt able to like to declare to my friends like I want to be a methodologist when I grow up. um, but it matters a lot to them too. About half of the students in the Qual PhD program here at Alabama actually have transferred from other doctoral programs where they were not being supported, they were not being mentored well, and they took the research classes because they had to, and they got in our classes and they were like, "You care about us," and we're like, "Well, of course we do," but they're like, "Well, but our program doesn't." And so we've gotten these really phenomenal doctoral students in our degree program because they weren't being mentored and supported elsewhere. And so like we started to really look at like how does mentoring matter relative to developing this methodology identity, but also like how does mentorship look and work when that mentorship is actually peer to peer, not just faculty student. And so like flipping that paradigm of like mentorship is always top down, but also looking at like what does it mean laterally, and thinking about like how that matters to qual as well. But again, like that's another project that's come directly from my experiences and from the experiences of people I care about and am invested in. And so that's, and I think that, I mean, that this goes back to like your point earlier about like we live and breathe qual. If I'm writing and doing qual that is emphasizing the importance of personal experience, personal narrative, personal understanding, it makes perfect sense then that my research questions, my research purposes would be directly tied back to those concepts of personal questions, personal understandings, personal experiences. And so, I've never seen people more miserable than those people who are exploring topics that don't matter to them, because they've let someone else hand them, what it is that they're going to explore. It's always kind of painful to see people do that. If you're going to do that kind of work, because I mean, I do occasionally, you should get paid really well for it. If you're not getting paid really well for it, then I don't know if that's a good use of your energy and time, because you're still having to deal with and monitor your own emotions, your own experiences, your own understandings, without being able to use research as a way to engage with and advance your own reflections of your experiences and what you need. And I think if research is doing the work that it's supposed to do, that it's also it's changing you in meaningful ways as a researcher. It's not just something that we do to try to check boxes off and get an article out, or check boxes off and get grant funding. Research that is truly effective, research that's truly done well, is research that matters to the researcher and the people that we're pulling into the research to be the participants. And if it doesn't, if it's not like this, if it's not this bilateral, sort of experience and engagement, then you're going to be checked out of the process, and that's a pretty disrespectful way to use your time and a pretty disrespectful way to use your participants' time. And so that would be my answer. Like, I think that all research projects at their heart need to have heart. I think they need to be based in in the human elements of who we are and of the humans that we're involving. And that's quant and qual. That's not just qual, period. Research,
Mhm.
full stop.
Yeah, that was an interesting thing when you talked about transcription. And as you were talking, because I mean, we have had this conversation before, and I kind of recalled a few years ago, there was that panel ICQI about interviewing. That it was
Yeah.
you, there was Glenn Phillips, Ivana Lincoln, and even remembering that panel, the question. I mean, I'm trying to remember who, but it was either you or Glenn who came up with this. I mean, one of the questions that was, what do we do with the transcripts? And I remember that question, what do we do with the transcripts?
Yep.
Kind of like, or no, was rather, what do we do with the data after we have transcribed?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it comes to and I personally don't like outsourcing the transcripts. I mean,
No.
I could have someone in my team do it. I mean, for the chapter we just got published, I mean, one of my students actually
Yeah, someone you
transcribed the
trust.
interview. Yeah, but my student transcribed it, and then I went back. But I think interviews are something you do. I mean, I would say this to my students and people who will be watching this video later, when it's on YouTube. Um, you don't want to outsource the data because especially because as you're listening to the data, there there are so many things that start popping in. I mean, there is all these sensorial and elements to the experience, the vicarious experience that Stake talks about,
Yes.
that really come into play when you're listening to the interviews. Because I mean, I don't know maybe your experience, but when I'm listening to the interviews, there are the sounds, and there is the laughter, and that there is and the laughter can trigger a memory
Pauses.
that helps
Hi.
interpretation. So if you send it to someone to transcribe, what you are doing is, I mean, you're doing yourself a disservice as a researcher, because you're actually not using yourself as the true instrument of your
Right.
research. So I think that
Right.
issue, the transcription is important. And again, but it's also the ethical matter that you just brought up about the sensitivity of the data. That sometimes we're working with vulnerable population. We had the conversation yesterday about ethics, introduction to ethics, that we do in this class. And we talked about that. What it means, what does it mean to work with vulnerable populations? What does it mean to work with children? What does it mean to work with people who have otherwise been silenced over the years? And what does it mean when I'm working with them and they're trusting me with their words?
Mm-hmm. 100%. I will also say there's a lot of research. Blake Poland has done a lot of research on the fact that transcriptionists get a lot of things wrong. And what Blake Poland's, because she's like one of the preeminent, experts on interview transcription, but she did her dissertation. She was doing it on some sort of project related to like depression or sadness. But she started to go through the transcripts, and she was like, I don't remember this being what this person said. And so she went back to the audio and started to check it, and it was completely different. And so her dissertation became like an exploration of those differences. But what they found was, because this particular interview project was exploring issues of depression and sadness, the transcriptionists decided that they were gonna like brighten it up and make it happier. It was too depressing. They were gonna make it better. So they were making all these changes to the transcript that they thought were improving it. And it completely changed the meaning. And the thing was, like, had she not gone back and been the one who had conducted that interview and realized there's some mismatch here between what I remember and what's on the page, the reality is that research team would probably have moved forward without any question about the veracity of that data. Because it's like, once we get transcriptions on a page and they are static and still, we just accept them as fact. We don't go back to the audio typically. It's just like, this is our artifact, and now we're going to move forward with it like just being the truth. And the reality is, like, transcriptionists get things wrong, either because they're human, or because they make deliberate decisions to change things, or because they lack context. They weren't there, and so they mishear things, they misunderstand things. I inherited some outsourced transcription one time that was specifically about a unit where a teacher was teaching Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and the names of every one of the tales was completely wrong because the transcriptionists just didn't know Chaucer. And so, like, then you're trying to figure out, like, you're using context clues to try to figure out, like, which one of these tales is this teacher talking about in this moment, because the transcriptions are just inaccurate. And so it's, there's a lot of different factors. Like, once like, the more people you involve in anything, whatever it is, like making a grocery list, deciding on a menu, transcribing an interview, the more people you involve, the messier it gets. And so when you start bringing in these outside people, you're making a lot of assumptions about them having the same values that you do, them appreciating your participants' privacy in the same way that you do, them having the same context and content knowledge that you do, and none of those things are fair to assume. And so, it's like a lot of times you're paying for a product you're going to have to fix anyway.
That's a problem. But again, that's a big thing with transcription. And for the students in the class, that will be something we will revisit again next semester when we have the conversations about data collection, about what it means to do the interviews. And because you talked, that, and probably we'll use this video next semester as a springboard for those conversations about data collection and data analysis. At this point, I think I want to stop talking myself, and for two reasons. Reason number one, I get to talk to Stephanie more often outside of this, and two, because I think the students may have questions. So the students, or Edison, Zadie, Diego as our guest, you may have questions. This is a good time to ask questions you have about your own projects, about your understanding of research, about the meaning of life. I don't know, whatever comes to your mind at this point. We're opening the floor for your questions. So just open up the microphone if possible. I kind of ask you, if you have the cam, please turn it on at this point so Stephanie can see you as well. So the floor is open. So who wants to go first? Moment of silence, so while they think.
I feel like this silence is even more pronounced in
this. When you were like this, actually, totally.
I will say really quickly, while y'all are formulating your ideas, I put in the chat box 2 articles that I've written recently that are specifically about transcription. One of them is looking at the ways that, just like you were talking about, transcription makes you like sit with the data. It makes you like slow down and go back through the experience. And so one of them is specifically about the ways that doing that encourages reflexivity, encourages thoughtfulness on the part of the researcher. The other one, so I used to be an English teacher, and I always taught Frankenstein, and I hate Frankenstein. I hated Victor Frankenstein. I wanted the monster to eat him, but the monster was just too civilized to do that. But the other one is actually using Frankenstein, like the idea of like the creation of the monster, as a framework to explore this issue of transcription as a creative process. And it was a really fun paper to write, just because like I finally got to like use Frankenstein in a way that made me happy. But it's like, we really are, in many respects, like we really are like splicing together these various pieces to try to make something that works, kind of like the monster in Frankenstein. And so if any of you are interested in these, actually, I'll just email them to you is what I'll do. And then if anyone wants them.
Well, I think I'll definitely be using, I'm going to be using one. I'll surely be adding either of those or both of them to the list of readings for next semester. So that, for the part of the interview, I always like to bring new readings every semester. So I'll definitely add this too.
I will ship them your way.
Awesome. So anybody, any questions?
Hi, puppy.
Oh, they're the back. They're actually in the patio right now. Folks, any questions? Oh, well, no, Connor, you cannot ask questions.
Jasper's asleep. He can't answer them. I'm sorry.
Raúl.
Yes?
It is Eris.
Yeah, can you turn your camera on, Edison?
Sure, of course.
You are?
Yeah. Stephanie, how are you?
I'm all right. How are you?
Yeah, so fine, and thank you for being here, sharing with us your experience. I need to tell you that I felt like identification with you because, yeah, maybe when we start this research path, from the very beginning is very difficult for us because most of the time we don't have a clear direction or even what you want to do during these kind of things. And I want to share a little bit about my experience.
Yeah.
And I'm a social communicator and journalist,
Mm-hmm.
but during my career, I was interested in working with edu communication. So that's why at the very beginning, I decided to be involved in an ESP program focused on in teaching English. Yeah. And at the beginning of the ESP program, it was so difficult for me because even I learned English by myself.
Mm.
I never went to an English academy or something like that. So I remember when I started this path that old people there in the classroom spoke about papers, about methodologies, about a lot of things that in my case, it was totally new. Yeah, and it was, I don't know, 3 years ago. So I remember that part is for sharing with our students and obviously with our compadres because this is a path I believe that is not we don't have into account what is the limit
Mm.
because every single day you start finding new specific things and that is something that uh, calls my attention every single day. Then I started making the master program and I decided to work with Raúl. And it was one of my amazing experiences because I like to face my things. So I decided, okay, well, I like ICTs, I like technology, I like education. So I want to be focused on critical digital literacies. And
Mm-hmm.
who is the critical digital or who is the literacy master and the critical here in Colombia or here in
You
Medellin?
found
Yeah,
them.
yeah,
You found
Dr. Mora. Yeah, so my goodness, I remember the first time when I talked to him. I don't know. It was so difficult for me at the beginning of
this
the
man is
project.
here.
Imagine. I remember when he said, "Are you totally sure that you want to work with me?" Yeah. So yeah, it is. It was hard, but during this path, I learned a lot, and we are working for making a lot of things. And something that I appreciate is that this is a hard path, but it's also something that when you finish one goal, you can see back and you said, okay, yeah, it's something that calls my attention, is something useful for my future, is something that I could put in practice with my communities. So that is something that I want to ask you because obviously this is a very good process for us, but what could we identify in order to be meaningful with our institutions or with our societies or with our families? So what kind of components do you consider they could be useful for 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 engaging with our communities, for example? Yeah,
Mm.
because this is something that, yeah, most of the time we are in the same direction. We have some ideas, but how those ideas or from your experience, how those ideas are improved your environment, have improved your environment.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that's really important is for academics to remember to just keep it simple, to keep it accessible, to be honest when you don't know things or you're not sure about things. That's especially true if you're doing research that involves community members. But I think even just at the institutional level, there's a lot of posturing in academia, like people pretending they know more than they know, people using fancier terminology than is necessary. And it creates a culture where we all think that we don't know enough. We all think that we don't belong. It sows insecurity. And so I think that in terms of research, I think one of the most important things about research, period, for the researcher and for whatever you're producing as a researcher, I think it's really important to think about, like, is the point of this to make you feel and sound smart, or is the point of this to try to accomplish something meaningful? If it's the former, then use all your fancy words because it's really just for you and your ego anyway. If it's the latter, it's really important to try to be thoughtful about, like, do I understand what I'm doing? Am I able to make other people that are going to be involved in this process understand what's happening? Am I able to involve them in this process to make sure that they know what's happening? Because, like, I do a lot of research with teachers because that's the path that I chose. But it's like I can't go into schools and adopt this attitude of I'm the expert, that I know what's happening and I'm going to teach you, I'm going to show you. It's more of, I know some tools to help us get really good information. I know some tools to help us explore some questions, but I need for you as a teacher that's going to be involved in this research, I need for you to talk to me about, like, what is it that you want to learn? What is it that you want to be involved in? What's not clear? And so I think that some honesty and, frankly, some humility on the part of the academy is really important. I think that that when you're writing up research, one of the reasons I use narrative and use it a lot is because it's something that people can generally engage in, even if they don't have a lot of fancy letters after their name. And so making sure that when I'm writing up research, that it's accessible, that it's meaningful beyond just a bunch of other PhDs sitting in a fancy room somewhere. I think the other part of it too, though, I think if there were more honesty and more transparency in higher education, students like you, students like me when I was a student, students like Raúl when he was a student, like, I think we would not sit there and think we don't belong, we don't know. I think that if there were a greater degree of people just saying, I don't know this word, I don't know this term, I don't know this author. I think if there were a greater degree of conversation about what people didn't know, instead of this constant effort to try to show off what we do know, we would have a space where people felt more able to acknowledge places where we need to learn. And I also, as a side note, and I don't know if this is something that you've experienced or not, but I feel like there's an incredible degree of, there's this culture of busyness in academia. People have such a need to talk about all the various projects they're doing, all the various papers they're writing, all the various papers they're reading. When I was a graduate student, we would go out sometimes, like, have a drink or something, and we would leave, and it would be, I don't know, like 10, 11, 11:30, whatever, and people would be getting up to go, and someone would say something like, well, now I got to go home and write that paper. And it's like, you're not going to write that paper. You're going to go home and you're going to sleep, or you're going to watch TV, and that's fine. But there's, like, this culture of, like, we constantly have to look busier than we are. And a product of that is it creates anxiety for all of us. It creates anxiety for people like us because we think, well, do I belong here? Am I smart enough to be here? But it also creates anxiety because people are always worried about, well, these people are doing this and I don't feel like I'm doing nearly enough, or these people seem to understand these words, or these people, these concepts, and I don't understand them. And so it creates a culture of stress. It creates a culture of overwork, and no good research comes of that, and no good human interaction comes of that. And so I think for me, it's a matter of research should be simple, it should be honest, it should be transparent, and we as researchers and academics need to be open and honest and transparent, because I think that if research were that way and we were that way consistently, I mean, it would completely reshape education. It would completely reshape graduate education. It would completely reshape the academy. And so, and I'm sorry that you had experiences where you wondered if you belonged. You clearly do. But it's frustrating to me that there are a number of clearly brilliant people that the academy ultimately runs off or shuts out because there is such an investment in that tuxedo on the brain concept. And it's not necessary. It's not useful. What parts of your question did I leave out or did I not address? I have a pretty bad short-term memory.
Edison?
Sorry, could you repeat me, please?
What parts of your question did I not answer? I have a pretty poor short-term memory, so I may have not answered something you asked.
Now, in that cases, because even yesterday we were talking about how our research becomes important for our societies.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So, what kind of components we need to determine in order to be important in that time?
Got it. I think that in terms of competence, because I mean you're right. I mean ultimately you do have to know things. You have to know terms. Because it goes back to the story I told. I mean, I have to be able to explain why narratives count. In terms of competence, I think that I think it's important when you're a graduate student. So, all right. So let me answer it this way. I tell my graduate students this all the time. When you're an undergraduate, generally speaking, your classes are to try to drown you in information, and you try to catch as much as you can and hold on to it. When you're a graduate student, you start to read and think differently. Because now it's a question of what are your contributions going to be? How are you going to exist in this space as a peer? What sort of research would you generate to add to this space? And so you do have to have competencies to do that, right? And so I think that there's not like a clear-cut answer to your question. I think what needs to happen is when you all are reading for classes, if you encounter something that you really feel like, because all of you have moments when you read for class and you're like, that was really good, or I'm really glad I read that, or gosh, I wish I had read that before, or whatever. When you encounter those texts, those are moments for you to then go back to that text, because your thinking's got to change as a graduate student. Go back to those texts and ask yourself, what about this text worked for me? What about this text made sense to me? What are the tools that are being used in this text that I feel like could be useful to me? Because as an undergraduate, you're just reading for information. As a graduate student, you begin to read those same readings become mentor texts. They become examples of how you do this work. And so in terms of like what competencies do you need, I think that it's a question of like what competencies do the scholars that really resonate with you, what competencies do the scholars that really resonate with you seem to have, and what understandings can you gain from seeing them use those competencies in action? Because I mean, I knew, like, I was very interested in being able to use narrative research because I wanted stories to be research. And so whenever I engaged in research where people were just really effectively using that approach, it was teaching me some of the competencies that I needed to do that work well myself. And so I think for all of you, one of the functions of graduate education is that it offers you a rare moment to start learning about yourself. If you read a paper, if you read a book, you read an article, you read a chapter, and you're like, that was awful, that was terrible. That's also a really good experience for you because it begins to teach you the competencies that you don't want, you don't need to have. Those things aren't necessarily important to you. Or if you read a paper or something and it's a mix where you're really into the information, but the ways that information was presented were problematic. Those are competencies that you're gaining too, because they begin to teach you how you do things, but you don't do them well. And so, one of the things that you begin to do, so I guess this is my answer. The one competency I think every graduate student needs to have is the ability to evaluate scholarship for their own learning and their own purposes. Because if you can do that and do it consistently and do it well, you're going to learn so much about who you are. You're going to learn so much about what other people do to accomplish the kind of research that you want to do. If you read something and you just feel completely in over your head, that's not your world. If you read something and you're like, this is my jam, this is me, then you start paying attention to what's happening there. You start paying attention to how that work is happening on page. so that you can start learning how you could potentially then apply those skills for yourself. So I think, so competencies, critically evaluating texts to understand how they're put together, and what skills were necessary to put them together. And I think the other competency is just, frankly, it's a belief that you are competent. Because I think that that's really just missing from education in general. I think that so much of, especially graduate education, we're driven to feel like we are incompetent. We're driven to feel like we don't know things. And like, the thing is, like, it's okay to not know. It's not okay to decide that you don't need to know. It's not okay to give up on knowing, but it's fine to not know. And to realize that you are still competent and you still belong, even if you don't know those things. Because I mean, that was certainly, that was something that was missing from your previous experience. You were doing a lot of work and a lot of self-education, and that's incredible. I mean, your brain was being stretched super wide, but instead of feeling like, you're doing this incredible job, you're left to feel like you don't belong there. And that's not acceptable. Like, education shouldn't work that way. And so I'm glad that you found a way to come back and find support that you needed. But I think, that's not, I think that's a competence too. And I think it's a social competence. It's just realizing, like, you do belong, and it's okay if you don't know. It's normal to not know.
Yeah, it's normal to don't know. I love that part. Yeah, and really, I think we have to accept that we're all in the process of figuring things out, and that doing research on many aspects is a journey. It's a journey that we spend our entire lives once you get into this qual thing, this qual business, this qual lifestyle. It's just like it's a lifetime quest. I don't think it's gonna. You just finish one
No.
project and you go into the next. Thank you, Alison, for the great intervention. Are there any other questions from any of the students? Don't be shy.
Hello, Raúl. I'm Sadie.
Hey, Zadie, can you turn the camera on?
Hello, Stephanie. Okay, let me. Okay.
You all seem so unwilling to turn your cameras on.
Hello,
Hi.
Sadie. I don't have a question, but I
That's
need
okay.
I need the feeling that it's something that you made the researcher work like a possible or achievable journey. I like your word, and you sound comfortable when you talk about your purpose and how to make it, and your process. Yesterday we were talking about when we felt that we are doing wrong research and we had bad steps in the research. So when I hear you and I pay attention to your words, I feel like, again, I repeat, like a research, like an achievable task, something that belongs to us, something that is connected with your life, your
Mhm.
personality, with your interests, with your goals. When I start the master process, some of my professors, I respect all of them, but they sound like oh, research is a hard work. Getting the degree is a hard work. You have to be alone, you have to work alone, and you have to be all the time working and working in your masters. When I listen to you and I feel this kind of relaxed words, something like that. like, okay, we can do it. It's something that you have to connect with the whole activities, your daily routines. Is something that you can make possible and you can achieve with some, okay, I can do it. And I
Yeah.
started the process, and listen to you help me to work in that I can continue working on my thesis, my master thesis, with many purposes, not just for getting a degree, just for connect and improve myself. And when you say the word that when you make a process of research, you read different, you write different. I want complete your ideas because you feel different, and
Mhm.
you see opportunities for researchers in all what you do. You walk in the street and you find something. I can do something. I can connect this. in our culture, in our society. I am a teacher in a public school where the English is the wrong subject, and I feel that many of our routines can be connected with the English. Sometimes we require this purpose in order to research and get the concepts and get the strategies that help me that my students can feel the same, connect the English with their daily routines. This was one of my purposes when I did the master process, and I want continue and I want to continue working on that because it's something that they require, it's something that is necessary. When I say it's something, I'm talking about English. And it's something that they can enjoy working on that, learning on that, and practice is not just like the school subject. I want to erase from my students' mind this idea of English is a hard subject, is the wrong subject of the school. Thank you for your words again. Thank you when you say about the honesty, the humility, how to be humble with this. And because in that way we can continue working and we can becoming the better researchers. Thank you so much, Steffi.
Thank you.
Stephanie.
That was
Yeah.
beautiful. You're a poet.
No, no, it's
Beautiful.
your words
No,
inspire.
those are your words. Well. I'm flattered. But I mean, no, I mean that's a good example of. I mean, that's important research that will matter. And and you were talking about, like your students will not be scared of English, and they'll be happy. You'll be happy too. And I think, like, I didn't say that. I think I implied it, but I want to say it now that Zadie had said this. Research can and should make you happy. Like I am happy and excited to do the research that I do. I don't go to work and go, I don't want to. There are days when I say I don't want to do something. Just to be really clear, it's not like there's like this magical unicorn meadow, but I mean, but I'm excited to do the work that I do because it matters to me, and I think that it matters to the people who are involved in it. And so it'll be the same for you. It will matter to the students, it will matter to the school, and it will matter to you. And so it's something that you can be excited about. I mean, research isn't scary. Research is useful. Research helps us to understand things that we need to try to get a grapple on. And because research is useful, it's like anything else. Like it can make our lives better. It can make our lives happier. And so, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people end up being intimidated by it. And you're right. A lot of faculty do create these ideas that research is just really hard and it's inaccessible. Because I have students come to my class and they don't want to be there. They're very clear. They don't want to be there. They have put this class off as late as they can possibly put it off because they don't want to take the class. And then they get in there and it's not scary. It's, we're gonna engage with these topics in ways that are meaningful, that are useful, that are accessible, because I want them to leave and do research, not be terrified of it. And so, yeah, so I mean, you're exactly right. I need to hire you to be my publicist.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something, your words help me to remember that I feel so proud when my students get involved on that because my students did all the process with me. When I start the master, I say I am going to make my master process, so I will need you. When I graduated, they graduated with me. Before my graduation times, they make a special event in order to congratulate me in order to
Oh,
that. And it's not, it's something that I want to say too. You engage the people we are working with, because if you invited, if you say I'm doing that, I want to do this, I want to help this, and I need your help in this time, in this part, in this process, is the way that they are the participant.
yes.
A participation is active, but I think that you require a purpose or require a meaning in order to do that. If I say I'm going to master, maybe, and no more, and I don't invite and I don't engage, and maybe my result could be worse or small steps in order
Mhm,
to continue
mhm,
working.
mhm.
Yes, but thank you so much for your work. It's a
Thank
great opportunity
you.
to know. And thank you, Raúl, for the for invite her.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm excited about your research, Zadie. It'll be exciting.
yeah, you're so excited. Thank you.
Congratulations.
oh, my mute. Now, now we just heard from the TAs, from Zadie and Edison. I want to hear from the students. Uh,
Ro, can I ask a question?
yes, but you know that. I mean, but first of all, turn your camera on, Diego.
I was just asking for, let me, I think, I don't know what's going on with the camera. Start video.
I had that issue yesterday on a Zoom call.
Yeah, that happens. Don't worry. Just if you can.
There's no judgment. I can look at your name and imagine.
Yeah. So
Okay.
Diego, go ahead. Go ahead. Ask the question. If you can go to the camera on, there's no worries, no biggie. Just go ahead.
All right. Okay. First of all, good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon, Professor Shelton. It's very, very exciting for me to listening to you.
Steph,
I
fine.
Okay, Stephanie. It's very exciting because I was thinking here like when I have read some of your articles, but I think it's very different experience when I have the possibility to listen to you, all right? And I feel
Real person.
yes, and as probably as I decided before, it's like it's very motivating actually for us that we are starting this process to listen to your experience and the way that you develop like yeah like your experience in this area. Probably I when I wrote to you before, I explained that I was also working with queer theory, and I started working with this probably after I started with Raúl classes, and it was like the same idea, like work about something that it was important for us, working about something that really was relevant from our own experiences. And probably in my case, it was because I am a gay teacher working in probably in a context, and I live in a context where sometimes you see the inequities and you see that sometimes things are not working in the way that you would love to do. All right. Um, so one of the questions that I would like to ask you now is you always make connections with other problems, not only about only queer and sexuality, but also all the other areas that are around that. Let's say, for example, class and race and how all those topics are connected. My question in this moment, it's about one additional aspect that I consider important in this moment, and it's the situation that we're facing with um, the virus and the pandemic that we're having now. And in my opinion, I think that this is going to change completely the way that we do things.
Yes.
And probably in research, I think that there are some situations that are going to change. Right now, I'm thinking and I'm trying to make up my mind about what is going to happen now that we are in the middle of a research and we want to be in contact with our participants, but right now we don't have that possibility. And also because probably in the school we were trying to create a safe space for them, for the participants, where they feel free to talk about their problems, their situation, their experiences. And when you mentioned it before, like they need to trust us that this information is going to be confidential, and probably they're going to be more open about that. I'm feeling a little bit worried about what is going to happen now, all right? Because probably we need to look for other alternatives, other methodologies. When I read about methods and methodologies, it's always like there is not like a specific um, like a method or something clear that we have to do. It's open according to the research that we are working with. And in this moment, I'm thinking about that, how this is going to affect research, how this situation is going to affect the way that we're going to collect data, and most important, how it's going to affect the fact that we want to be in contact with our participants, because otherwise I think that it's going to be very distant, and it's going to be, I mean, it's going to lose that important thing that you were mentioning before, and it's about being human and how important is this for them.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if my question was clear. I'm quite nervous, I have to say, but
Oh.
but is it clear what I
Yes, yes, and it's a very very important question. I think that I think you're absolutely right. This pandemic is necessarily changed. It's changing, and it will change, but it has changed the way that we have to do research if we're going to be responsible and thoughtful researchers. So you're exactly right. I think that there are some advantages to us needing to do so much digitally. Um, I have participants who are now actually more available than they were before, because now they're at home. They're not, we're not having to schedule around a school day, for example. And most of them, if they need privacy, can usually, like, at least go into a bedroom or a bathroom for 15, 20 minutes. It does mean that that a lot of the interviews that I have to do tend to be shorter, because a lot of them, before we would block out like an hour or two, and now it has to be 15, 20-minute short periods, as they can manage to find that time. But I will also say, in terms of building community, I try to check on and text my participants on a regular basis. I mean, now a number of them, we had never exchanged phone numbers, but I gave all of them my phone number and said, we're in a different time right now. And so, email may not work for you. And so feel free to text me. And nearly all of them have at this point. And so I just text them occasionally just to say, like, I hope you're having a good day. I hope you're all right. And that's something that, before I didn't necessarily do. And I think that's helped. And it's something that I think even after all this is over, we're not necessarily going to go back to the normal we had before, but when we have a new normal that allows us to be outside of our houses again, I think it's something I'm going to try to continue to do, is give them access to me and let me, have opportunities to just sort of check on them, send them, a positive thought, because I didn't do that before. And I think part of that was because I took the face-to-face interaction so for granted. And so that's a positive that's come from it. Another thing, I have one project that was actually funded by a grant from NCTE, where it's like a professional development group where they've read different social justice books and thought about how they would apply them to school. Well, everything's changed now, right? Like, I mean, their students are online and so on. And so some of that's had to stop. They aren't able to read books at the same rate they were reading them before, when everything was, much more was much more anticipated, much more regular. But what we have started to do is actually yesterday evening, we don't meet necessarily to have book discussions. We do that some. We do it less than we did before. But we met on Zoom just to hang out for a little bit, just to see one another, see how people were doing. If people needed to complain, let them complain. If people needed to laugh, to let them laugh. And so if you've got a group of people who all know one another, because they've all been involved in like group discussions, focus groups, and so on, it's not a method per se, although, I mean, in the future, I'm going to have to include that in my method section, because that's a form of community building and relationship building that had to become necessary given the current circumstances. And so, there are some ways, there are some situations, though, because of the research that you and I both do, where some people are at a different level of risk than they were before. And so you're talking about like setting up the safe spaces in schools, for example. A lot of students and even some educators don't necessarily have a safe space outside of a school environment. And so I think one of the important parts of your question is like, well, what does that look like now? And the answer is, I don't know. One of the reasons that I've given access to myself through my phone number is because some of them, they at least have their own phone, even if they don't like necessarily have their own phone typically. And they can just say like, I'm having a really rough day. Like, they don't add Because some of them, like especially if they're young adults or they're living with their parents, like they don't want to text things that are going to compromise their home situation. But they can say like, I'm having a really rough day. And I got an email from one that was like, he feels very confined because now that he's home with his parents, his gender expression is masculine, and he doesn't feel able to dress that way now that he's back home with his parents, and he's very frustrated, he's very depressed. But giving him a place to be able to just say that to someone that he knows is going to be supportive has been really important to him. And I've also I've found like free online counseling services for him to be able to access that too. And so those are moments when he's able to be in the bathroom for 10 minutes and just like send a quick text or something, or a quick email. And so I think it's not that there are not ways to do it. I think it's that we're going to have to like really think outside of what we have typically done in the past, because you're absolutely right, Diego. Like we're going to have to do things differently. And especially because of the kind of work that you and I do, we have to be really thoughtful about the ways that what we're asking participants to do might in fact put them at greater risk because of where they have to physically be situated. And so I think that it's just a matter of being thoughtful about it, being really, really careful and reflexive. And this goes back to Zadie's comment from earlier. This is an important moment when, as a researcher, you start to put participants' needs well before your own. And so like in a number of these studies, like I've had to pause data collection because that's just not what's important right now. What's important right now is that they know that I care about them as people. They know that I'm invested in their well-being. And sometimes they want to have a discussion, sometimes they want to have an interview, and that's great, that's fine. But I mean, part of it is just, it goes back to humanizing the research process. And if you're going to humanize the research process, that includes remembering that you're a human and remembering that they're humans and that we live in this very messy, complex, scary time. And so thinking about what that looks like. And so the short version is, I don't know either, Diego, but I'm trying to figure it out, and I'm trying to be really thoughtful about what that kind of work looks like in a way that is humanizing and honors their time and their energy.
Actually, I want to jump in here because, and I mean, the way the topic of the session, I think I told you, is called Figuring Out Qualitative Research. And I think it comes very apropos to the situation. Even the questions we're raising about what it means to work with the participants today. And even yesterday, I was telling the students before we began the discussion on ethics, that even the kinds of studies that we are going to be conducting during this time. I'm specifically thinking about terminal work at this stage, for example, the master's thesis and even dissertations. But I'm thinking specifically master's thesis because they're short term. So the students only have this semester, next semester to prepare their proposals, and then next year to do whatever it is that we're going to do. And at this point, I told him, listen, I don't even know if field work it's going to cut it. One of my master's students, she had to completely overhaul her proposal, and she's going to be doing a meta-analysis because it's more convenient. And I said, we're going to have to start contemplating that meta-analyses, research syntheses, analysis, meta-syntheses, stuff like that is going to have to become a very viable possibility. That I already told the students, you're going to have to start contemplating the possibility that maybe your work is not going to be a field study that you're going to conduct in your class, but maybe it's going to be a more care, and maybe this would be a good opportunity. I mean, I've been one person who's, even in the program, I have strongly advocated for looking at things like meta-analysis and research syntheses as very viable.
Well, and autoethnography.
Autoethnography. Oh yeah, we have already done this. Yeah.
We have a number of PhD students who have had to shift to an autoethnographic dissertation. Because they can't collect data right now.
Exactly.
And that's fine.
Autoethnography, and even do ethnography could be. We've already had I haven't done it myself because it wasn't popped up, but Paulina herself, she's already had a couple of students exploring ethnography in their master's thesis. And so I told them, we're gonna have to start thinking of discourse analysis, content analysis, like, I mean, alternative methods, because we cannot wait for this situation to blow over so you can go back to the schools and do your field work. No, we're gonna have to get super creative. But I think it's also an opportunity to figure out what we want to get out of, especially at the master's level, because I think, and I'm gonna put this openly on this video, knowing that this is my opinion and I'm gonna deal with the heat. But maybe but I'm thinking maybe it is time to start really making a very clear distinction between what master's level research and doctoral level research look like, because sometimes we are still falling prey to treating the master's thesis as a mini dissertation.
No, that's right. You're right. You're absolutely right.
And I think that is causing unnecessary stress on students. I mean, something as simple, I'm thinking of even off the top of my head. A lot of people sometimes in research, they talk about using needs analysis as the introduction, kind of like an introduction to justify the project. And I'm always thinking, wait, a needs analysis, if it's well done, it's a study.
Right. Yes.
It's a full study. I mean, I've even told people like, yeah, I need to do a needs analysis. Then why don't you just, instead of doing this very quick and dirty needs analysis that basically becomes a pilot study, because I don't even know when it's a needs analysis, when it's a pilot study. Just think about what a needs analysis is, because a needs analysis is actually a case study.
100%. Well, and not only that, but it typically results in better research because you're allowed to go deeply into a particular area. Because I do think, so in some respects, I think that what we ask master students to do ends up being harder than what we ask doctoral students to do, because what we ask doctoral students to do is basically like find this 1-inch plot that is theirs and then to dig down very deeply into it. With master students, we're asking them to dig almost as deeply, but we're giving them a much wider area that they're responsible for excavating. And it's not fair. It's not right. And so I think that you're absolutely right. Teaching master students to try to confine an area, now it makes it more manageable. It makes it much more reasonable, period. I mean, without even the given circumstances of the world today, it makes it, it makes it more manageable, but it improves the quality of the research. And if the point, like a lot of administrators, they use the explanation of, well, we need for them to be ready to go into a doctoral program. Well, number one, not all master students will, but number two, if that is indeed the point, if that is your driving force, helping them to learn to narrow what they're being asked to do would actually prepare them far better than what they're currently asked to do.
Absolutely.
I mean, if that really is like the administrative explanation, which it often is, it's like, well then, but what we're asking them to do then is unreasonable. Let them have a narrow space, just like we ask our students to do, and then to dig down into that.
Well, here's a little different, because I mean, and when I talk about this recalibration is because it's happening, right? It's something that is happening in real time. Because having doctoral programs in education, I mean, it's something very recent for us. And so for example, in second language studies, only until the last 3 years, we now have doctoral programs in English, like in English language teaching. So back in the day, a lot of what you would see were actually mini dissertations. So then, and I started questioning, well, what is the point? Not of doing good research, but that we always have to go into fieldwork. Especially when something like this happens, and this whole situation has thrown a monkey wrench on everybody's projects. All my grad students are struggling, and I'm okay saying this, because we need to say this. We need to acknowledge our grad students are struggling, because many of them are school teachers, and they were thinking their goal was to do their research in their schools. This whole situation threw a monkey wrench in their entire plan, and now they're scrambling to figure out what to do. And that's when we have to say, no, we have to think that maybe this is an opportunity to revisit the alternatives that we are offering master students for the thesis.
It's a really useful time for educational research in general, just because, I mean, it goes back to like we all were taught at very early ages, like what counted as research. And you know, and we're surrounded by media outlets who continue to reinforce this idea that research is a very specific thing. And research, when we are presented it in pop culture, is always empirically based, always. And a lot of the research that I do is empirically based, like I acknowledge. But I mean, but the fact is, it's not necessary to have any sort of field component to have really effective, evocative, powerful research. And I think you're right. This is it's an important opportunity to have everybody, qualitative and quantitative researchers, begin to really interrogate why is it that for so long we have centered empirical and just because I was that student that was like, I don't know what empirical research is. Empirical research is basically, in a nutshell, it's observable things, like observable data, like observing in classrooms, observing at a football game, observing at, you know, a store, and interviewing people, you know, whatever. And so much of what we understand research to be, so much of what we understand to count as research relies so heavily on empiricism. And there's no reason for that. I mean, it's a really phenomenal opportunity to redefine how we understand scholarship. You know, and all of you who are master's students, I mean, you're getting to help drive the vehicle that does that work. And it's scary because you don't know what's happening, and so many of the things that you had anticipated doing are now going to have to necessarily be different. But I think part of it is just beginning to reconceptualize, like, what gets to count as research. And a lot of these meta-analyses, a lot of personal reflections and personal narratives and personal autoethnographies, like, those are research too. And they're important sources of data. And I think the field as a whole, education as a whole, would benefit from more of those items being a part of what we're using to generate understandings and knowledge.
And I think slowing down. I mean, I think that when you think about this kind of studies, because I really worry, again, I mean, language in second language education. I mean, I'm bridging second language education and literacy studies.
Yeah.
So I look at this, and sometimes I see that there's a proliferation of empirical studies. I mean, that we always have this rush that we have to do more field work. But then, I mean, and then what happened is that some fields or some subfields in these areas are already saturated with empirical research, but we haven't had time to stop and look, okay, what have we learned from the studies as a collective? And I think this could be, and again, it's an invitation for the students to, as they're making the proposals, reconsider the possibility that maybe this could be a good moment to think. Maybe I don't need to do overly empirical field work. Maybe I can take some time to really revise the field, or again, going to that overly the reflexive strand that in the opportunities for that strong reflexivity that autoethnography provides as alternatives, because as alternatives. So in this could be viable alternatives for, and again, this is an invitation for anybody who watches this video, for instructors who watch this video, for grad students who watch this video, to rethink. Because if we are going to wait until you can go back and do your field work, I mean, yeah, it's going to change. And even even if you're going to do the field work, it's going to change. Now we have to start contemplating a simple question such as, what do focus groups look like if you're Zooming? How are you going to, I mean, I had that question with my research team a few days ago. And it's like, okay, we started kind of doing this experiment, asking everybody to put pseudonyms in their, instead of pictures, putting pseudonyms and not putting the cameras, and playing with that for a while. See, okay, what would this look like? Because we need to, I mean, that is also going to be a question about what is data collection going to look like in these new times? What is the analysis going to look like in these new times? So I think in a crisis like this, figuring out qualitative research it's more relevant than ever.
Yeah, and it goes back to Diego's question too. I mean, what do relationships in qualitative research look like in this time? I will say, as a side note, relative to the meta-analyses, my favorite paper that I've ever published was actually based on me starting to read a lot of the scholarship on the topic of LGBTQ teacher allies. And as I read it, I started to get really angry because I'm like, these people don't know what it's like to teach these issues. These people don't know what it's like to support these students in real schools, because so many of the scholars who were writing on this topic were in university settings. And so they had a lot of flexibility and freedom that I just didn't have when I had been a high school teacher. And so that analysis of all those other people's discussions of that topic became the basis of like my own exploration of all the ways that this literature just misses the issue of context, like just misses the ways that where you are matters in terms of how that work looks. And it was incredible to me that it wasn't something that people had talked about in the existing scholarship, but it was only because I did slow down and just read what was out there. And it gave me such an important realization of there's this huge missing chunk of what needs to be a part of these conversations. Because so much of that literature was very teacher blaming, like teachers should do these things. And if teachers aren't doing these things, then they're terrible teachers. And there was no real acknowledgement of the ways that where teachers are matter to the sort of work that they can do, what resources teachers have, relate to the kind of work that they can do. And so one of my favorite papers was a direct result of diving into that stuff. And a huge basis, the Frankenstein transcription, actually both of the transcription papers that I sent you, there's no empirical data at all. It is just, no, that's not true. The reflexivity one, there is a little bit of empirical data, but they're just a discussion of the ways that people have problematically engaged with, written about, and talked about transcription. And so, I mean, like, you can do amazing scholarship and never observe a single thing, never interview a single person. And I think you're absolutely right. Like, it's time to start really thinking about like ways that looks and counts. And then also like looking at like really interrogating, like, what do these new spaces look like? What do relationships in this new space look like? And relative to Diego's and my interest in terms of our identities and our research, like, what does it mean to ask participants to engage in potentially personally risky topics in this particular space? Those are all incredibly important questions, and they don't necessarily involve a single bit of field work.
Well, this is amazing, and we could go on and on for hours, but I think at this point we have to think of everybody. No, we do, and we will. I just want to kind of wrap up the session. There is always one question I ask in the LSLP session webinars when we have the guests, and it's always the question of, okay, remember, as you know, these are all first-year master students. They're still trying to figure out their way in the world. They didn't ask questions because probably they have more. That right now they're trying to process everything that happened today. So I imagine I know they're very incisive students and they're very inquisitive, but there is so much information that sometimes you just need to digest it. I mean, there is sometimes when you have such a delightful as such a hearty meal. I was like that word from the Sherlock Holmes stories, that he always had a hearty meal. You need time to digest it. But the question I want to ask is, and it's like, what final piece of advice would you give these beginning researchers, all of them here, Zadie, Diego, students? What final advice would you give them as they navigate their path into developing their projects and considering becoming researchers?
I'm going to tell you a rule I have in my classroom, and it's going to connect to the advice that I would give you. A rule I have in my classroom is that students are not allowed to apologize for having questions. It's something that students do a lot, especially at the graduate level, where they'll be like, I know this is a dumb question, but, or I'm sorry, I have a question, but, and it always happens the very first day of class, and I immediately stop class. And I explain, like, we're not going to do this. Like, we're not going to have this crazy, like this long, I'm so sorry, I have a question, or I know this is a really terrible question, or you probably answered this, but we're not going to do that. If something's not clear, you need to ask. And so I think that's like, my advice is, first of all, realize there is nothing intuitive about academia. There's nothing intuitive about it. And so if there's something about this world that doesn't make sense to you, it's not you. It's the space in which you find yourself. It's not some lack on your part. You can always learn more. This space is not an intuitive space. And so the other part of that is, so in recognizing there's nothing intuitive about this process of higher education, the other part of it is to be unapologetic and unrelenting in asking questions you have. And if people make you feel like you are lesser than, or that you don't know enough when you ask those questions, the other part of that advice is to disengage from those people. You don't need those people in your life. Find people who value your questions, who value you wanting to learn more, who support you as a learner. Because it goes back to, if there's a moment when you feel like you're inadequate, if you feel like you don't belong, that's not necessarily the issue. The issue is the space and the people filling that space. And so just realize you have a lot of choices in terms of who you get to affiliate with. You have a lot of choices in terms of people that you can reach out to. I mean, Diego has emailed me. Find people whose work you like, reach out to them. Academics are typically delighted for people to email them and be like, I read your stuff. I mean, we're just like, whoa, you read my stuff? My mom doesn't read my stuff. So if you're reading my stuff, I'm thrilled, right? And so nothing intuitive about it. Don't flinch from asking questions, and don't loop yourself in. Don't attach yourself to people who make you feel like the first two parts are a problem. If you don't know something, don't let other people feel like you somehow are inadequate because you don't know something. Part of the point of education is to learn. I mean, it's a problem if you're not willing to learn, but for anyone to make you feel like you're lesser than because you haven't already learned is someone who doesn't understand the purpose of education. And you don't need that person in your life.
I think that's beautiful advice. And I think that I will say nothing further because because that's what we need to do. Be unapologetic about who you are as a scholar. Be yourself at all times, no matter what, and be true to yourself. I think that's important as we are trying to figure out all the uncertainty of doing research, and we're trying to figure out what it means to be a scholar. Because I always tell the students during the transition from being teachers to becoming scholars, and that it's a beautiful path, it's a beautiful journey, and this takes time. And then, because I mean, I don't think there is a manual on the handbook on becoming a scholar. I don't think there is such a thing. It's
I haven't
a journey.
found it.
No, and I don't. And honestly, if they had it, I wouldn't read it.
No, because I imagine the people that would write that would probably be the very people that would make you feel inadequate and make you feel like you shouldn't ask questions.
Too much, a little huffing and puffing, so it's not good. So I want to take a moment to thank you, Stephanie, for your time, for the kindness of your words, because there is a lot of kindness there, and sometimes in academia we're in short supply of kindness.
Oh no, there's definitely should be more kindness.
So there is kindness, and there is power, and there was scholarship, and you can see that there is literature behind it, there are theories behind it that don't necessarily have to pop and surface every 5 minutes, but it's there. I know it's there because I read your work and we've talked. So I appreciate you taking time to spend it with the students. And I really hope that the students in the class, and then once this video is on YouTube, people who listen to this, they get some valuable life lessons about the journey of doing Qual, because it's a journey.
It is definitely a journey. I appreciate the invitation. Thank you. And I'm excited for all of you. I'm excited to see the ways that you move forward as scholars, as thinkers, as educators. And I mean, and figure out your path. Don't let other people lay your path down for you. And so I'll be excited to see all of you in the future.
Definitely. So again, my gratitude to you. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. The students, I'm gonna kindly ask you to stick around a few more minutes just for some final logistics. And once again, Stephanie, thank you for helping the students see or hear other voices and hear the beauty of this field that we call qualitative research. For those of us who are either methodologists or people who use, or people, as my advisor said, that there are people who are methodologists, and there are people who use methods to do research. I call myself the former, and for those of us, it's always beautiful to talk about research and learn about research. So I truly appreciate your time, and you can see all the students are sending all the shout outs of gratitude for the conversation today.
Thank you all. Enjoy your conversation, and I appreciate the invitation. This has been a delightful way to spend part of my Saturday. So, mwah.
Thank you, Stephanie, and for everybody watching the video, thank you for following us. And again, quick shameless plug. This is part of YouTube series that we have, the Literacies and Economics project called LSLP in Session, where we record webinars that we have in class, and then we just put them on YouTube for people to engage in conversations. So for everyone watching the video, thank you very much.